So we're going to look at Hebrews. We're at Hebrews chapter 4 now. We're not going to read it just yet. Before we broke up for the summer, we started the first few chapters, and I'd like to finish the book before we move on to something else. But a quick recap, though, because it's been a while since we looked at Hebrews. If you remember, Hebrews is a letter written to Christians who came from Judaism. So they were Jews previously. They were steeped in all the Jewish culture and rituals and traditions. And then they convert to Christianity. They follow Jesus Christ. And what's the word? They're trying to figure out how to follow Jesus in this new way when we have all these old rituals and customs, and there's a temptation almost to go back to that, to go back to all those old rituals and customs. And it's a great thing for them. They have the history. They have the Old Testament. They have all the history that led up to Jesus. Other religions didn't have that. The Gentiles didn't have this benefit. But these Christian converts struggled with reconciling, that's the word I was trying to find, what they were being taught about Jesus and what they had previously been taught in the synagogue. And if you think about it, the Jews are so close. But unless they land on Jesus and his salvation, they're as lost as everyone else. And Paul talks about that in some of his letters. So you have a group of Christians here in Hebrews. They've had a history of Judaism. They've steeped in the temple rituals, and there's perhaps a temptation to go back to that. The problem is those rituals didn't save them. All those things that they had in the Old Testament were only place markers for something better to come, and we know that's Jesus Christ. So back then, and still many Jews don't realize or don't think that Jesus is the answer to all the prophecies in the Old Testament. So the law in the Old Testament is a place marker for Jesus. The Sabbath was a place marker for the rest that we would have in Jesus. The sacrifices in the Old Testament were place markers for the ultimate sacrifice that Jesus would make, and so on and so on. So if you remember when we started Hebrews is a written work showing all these Christians how Jesus is much better than all the stuff that they were doing. You thought all these things were great, the sacrifices and the law and all the rituals and the festivals. But Jesus is so much better. That's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to say. In case you're tempted to go back to that, listen, what you've got in Jesus Christ is so much better than any of that stuff you did before. And today, so it talks about Jesus being better than Moses and better than the angels. And last time we looked at the rest that Jesus brings being better than any Sabbath rest that came before. And today we're looking at the author talking about Jesus being better than the priests and the high priests in the Old Testament. And I'm sure you know this, but just to recap, the priests, and we looked at this on Sunday, the priests came from the line of Levi. So if you think about Abraham, had his son Isaac. Isaac had his son Jacob. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. You remember that? So the children of Israel are the children that come from Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. They're the 12 tribes of Israel. Levi is one of his sons. And Moses and Aaron were from the tribe of Levi. Now, Aaron was the first high priest. Okay, and because he was in Levi, Levites, their descendants became priests and Levites working in the temple. We talked about that on Sunday when we were looking at the tithe, because they didn't get land because they were working in the temple. So the Levites, the family line from Levi is the priests and the Levites, and they work in the temple, they sort out the sacrifices and worship and so on. The high priest was a specially selected person from that tribe who would offer sacrifices on the Day of Atonement, which is once a year, and they get to go into the most holy place in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the cloud was. In other words, God himself was dwelling in that part of the temple, and they get to go in there once a year to offer sacrifices. So that's where we are as a background. I hope you're with me so far. Turn to Hebrews 4, and we'll read from verse 14, and I'll just comment on it as we go through it. Now, this is the writer saying that how Jesus is better than these high priests. So he says, therefore, Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, that is Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So right there at the start, he's saying Jesus is a high priest. He is a high priest, a better high priest. He's a Son of God. So in case you're tempted to go back to the other faith, hold firmly to the faith you profess, because Jesus is a better high priest than any of his other high priests. And he then tells us why. Verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Now this is interesting because Jesus was fully God, but he was also fully human. So it's not like he doesn't know what we're going through. He knows very well what we're going through. He knows what you're going through. Whatever troubles and temptations you go through in your life, Jesus knows because he was tempted in every way. The difference is he didn't sin, like the other high priests did. So again, he's comparing Jesus to the high priest. He's saying, listen, Jesus is a better high priest. The other high priests, they sinned. Jesus didn't sin. He was tempted, so he knows what you're going through, but he didn't sin. Verse 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, this is huge here. Because for a Jew, nobody can approach the throne of God except the high priest, and once a year. Once a year. But through faith in Jesus Christ, the great high priest, we have access to God's presence at any time. Remember, the curtain in the temple was torn in two when Jesus died? That was demonstrating that access to God's very presence is now possible through our faith in Christ. So the author of the Hebrews is establishing that Jesus is way better than any high priest that you might think about going back to. Why would you go back to a high priest who can access the Father only once a year when you can have Jesus through whom we can access the Father any time we want? We're going to go into the presence of God, into the throne of God in a sense. Oh, it's all right. Do you have something to contribute in? We're going to enter the presence of God in a few moments to pray. We have access to the throne of God to bring our petitions to God. What do priests do? They interceded on behalf of the people to God. We can do that right now. I don't have to wait once a year. We can do that in a few moments in our prayers. All thanks to what Jesus did. So much better than any other high priest. So turn to then verse 1 of chapter 5. He continues to argue his point. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices to sin. In other words, to intercede on their behalf. Verse 2, he's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of people. Now, we'll come back to the sacrifices next time. That's the last sort of theme in Hebrews. But Jesus is better than any other high priest because he doesn't need to offer sacrifices for his own sins, because he knew no sin. Verse 4, no one takes this honor on himself, so no one asks to be a high priest. He receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, you are my son, today I have become your father. And he says in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. So what a priest did is they interceded on behalf of us to God. They sort of took our prayers and petitions, brought them to the Lord. That's what Jesus did. Verse 7, that's what Jesus did when he was on earth. He offered prayers and petitions to the one who could save him from death. So Jesus was acting like a priest when he was here on earth. That's the author's point. Because he was a priest. He was a high priest. Son though he was, verse 8, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So God designated Jesus to become a high priest, but not in the line of Levi, because Jesus didn't come from the line of Levi. Jesus is the Lion of Judah. He is from the line of Judah, not from the line of Levi. So he's not a high priest in the order of Levi, he's a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And now we come to this strange thing that I've wondered about for years, actually, but never really took the time to figure it out. I always wondered what Jesus has to do with this guy called Melchizedek. What on earth does this have to do with Jesus? Who is he in the first place? Well, if you remember from Sunday, Melchizedek is this guy who Abraham meets out of nowhere. And he gives Melchizedek a tenth of the stuff that he has, the plunder actually that he has, if you remember that from Sunday morning. So, the author actually tells you who Melchizedek is. After warning about falling away in chapter 6, turn to chapter 7 and verse 1. He says who Melchizedek is. Melchizedek was king of Salem and prince of God Most High. Priest, of God Most High. He made Abraham, returning from the defeat of the kings, and bless him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, what does that mean? Melchizedek had no father or mother. He does. The point is that this guy came from out of nowhere. Nobody knew who his father was. Nobody knew who his mother was. Nobody knew when he was born, where he was born. Nobody knew if he died. He's just sort of trapped forever in time in this passage of Genesis, and then he disappears again. There's no other mention of Melchizedek apart from in Psalm 110, where God says that you are a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, talking about Jesus. There's no other mention of him in the Old Testament. So he's kind of trapped in time as this priest who kind of never dies, is what the author's saying here, because we don't know when he dies. We don't know where he came from. We don't know his father or mother or genealogy. We know nothing about him. We just know he was a high priest, and Abraham gave him a tenth of what he had. Does that make sense? So Melchizedek didn't live forever, but he kind of is trapped in time as if he did live forever. But Jesus Christ is compared to Melchizedek because Jesus Christ is eternal. Verse 4. Think just how great he was, this Melchizedek. Abraham the patriarch gave him a tenth of the plunder. You can't get much higher than Abraham in the hierarchy. And he gave Melchizedek the tenth of the plunder. He honoured him. In verse 5, now the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their fellow Israelites, even though they are also descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without a doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So what was happening here? What the author of Hebrews is trying to say is, don't forget, he's writing to Jews. Jews are thinking, do you know what? I'm following Jesus, but there's all these high priests, and I get what they were doing there, and they interceded for us, and they met with God, and they offered sacrifices. And he's saying Jesus is much better than that. He is a high priest. And their argument might be, yeah, but how is he a high priest? Because he doesn't come from the line of Levi. High priests only come from the line of Levi. Jesus came from the line of Judah. How could he be a high priest? And so the author's saying, listen, see this Melchizedek guy? If you think of the Levites are here in the family tree of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then 12 tribes. So the Levites are down here, okay? Here's all the Levites in their family tree. Think of a family tree in your head. All the Levites are down here. And all the other tribes give their tenth to the Levites, okay? Who's above the Levites? Jacob. Who's above him? Isaac. Who's above him? Abraham. So in the hierarchy, Abraham's way sort of more important than down here, yeah? Well, what did Abraham do? He gave his tithe to Melchizedek, which makes Melchizedek much, much better than any Levite here. Does that make sense? Kind of with me? So that's what he's trying to say is, yes, Jesus didn't come from Levi, but he was much better than the Levites because he's in the same league as Melchizedek, because he's eternal. Because Melchizedek kind of was eternal in a sense, trapped in time. Jesus is eternal, much better. And the best guy in your whole religion, Abraham, honored Melchizedek. So that's how important Jesus is. So in case you're thinking of going back to your old religion, Jesus is much better than that. I hope that makes sense. So, to back that up, look at verse 11 of chapter 7. Kind of, the writer says what I just said in many ways. Verse 11, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still need for another person to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, and not in the order of Aaron? This is a rhetorical question. Perfection wasn't attained through the Levitical priesthood. He's saying, but if it was, we wouldn't need someone to come. But it wasn't. It wasn't good. Those Levitical priests never were making the mark. We need someone better, someone in the order of Melchizedek. Someone like Melchizedek needs to come. Someone eternal, Jesus Christ. And he continues into verses 12 to 14. Jesus came from Judah, but no priest were in the line of Judah, because Moses never mentioned that. But the Levitical priests were imperfect, so it was time that someone better than the Levitical priests came. Someone from an eternal line, but like Melchizedek, who was a priest forever. So, read on from verse 23 then. 23 there says, now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office. He's talking about the Levitical priests. There have been many Levitical priests because they kept on dying. They couldn't stay forever because they kept on dying. But because, verse 24, Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood, so much better. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. What an amazing verse it is. I'm going to read that verse out again. Jesus is able to save completely anyone who comes to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Jesus lives to intercede for you. And this is the key difference between the other priests and Jesus. Jesus lives forever. He will always be able to save us. He will always grant us access to the throne of God. Other priests died and were replaced. Even here in the church, ministers come, ministers go. But Jesus stays forever and intercedes forever. In a sense, my role as minister is to make myself redundant in many ways. So that rather calling for the minister, you cut out the middleman and go straight to God himself. That's what the author's saying here. The other priests came and went. Cut out the middleman, he's saying. Go straight to Jesus. He's a great high priest and he's always interceding for you to the Father. What an awesome thing that is. Verse 26, such a high priest truly meets our needs, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. No other Levitical priest was like that. Verse 27, unlike the other priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once and for all time when he offered himself. So Jesus didn't have his own sin to account for. No flaws, no imperfections, a perfect high priest who is holy and blameless and will never die. Think about the scandals that we have in churches these days, sadly. There's one's going on in Vineyard at the minute. If you heard of Ravi Zacharias, he was a great apologeticist, and then I think it was after he died, or around the time of his death, the big scandal came out about him. Mike Pilavachi was one in Soul Survivor there in London. So many more scandals. These people are held in high esteem in the church, like priests in a sense. They preach and they teach and they're a go-between between the congregation and God, bringing your requests to God, bringing God's word to you. But let me tell you from experience, and John can back me up here, we're not perfect. Far from it. And it's so sad when these scandals come about. It really pains me. But with Jesus, if we have Jesus on our pedestal, there'll be no scandal. Because he's perfect, holy, blameless. And he can intercede to the Father for you in a perfect way, an eternal way. Why would you come to the Father through anyone else, really? Why would you? In fact, Jesus says in John 14, verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Personally, I hate the title Reverend. I hate collars and robes and sometimes the pomp and ceremony that happens around ministers. And it's one of the reasons is actually, and I noticed this whenever we had our ordination. See, when I wore the robe, I felt proud. I felt important. And that caused me to sin then. I'm not special. I try to live each day for Jesus through his grace, but I have my own struggles and sins to deal with. Thankfully, I'm glad my name doesn't lend itself very well to titles, so that keeps me humble. But if you follow priests or ministers or pastors or whomever, even the greats like Tim Keller or John Piper, even John Calvin, Martin Luther, if you put them on pedestals, then you're going to be let down because they have their own weaknesses and their sins. And the author of Hebrews is saying, listen, Jesus doesn't have any of those weaknesses. He's the best person to follow. He's the best person to intercede to you or for you to the Father because he's perfect. And he gives you direct access to the Father. That's a great blessing for us.